Hey there, Guardians. My name's Doc, and today we are continuing our support tier list by talking about armor. Speaking of continuing, I want to sincerely apologize that it's taken me so long to get this video out. Life has been very hectic lately if you've been keeping up with the community tabs, but I promise you guys that you will not have to wait 3 more weeks for the perks and origin traits tier list. I'm going to try not to drag this intro out, so let's just quickly cover our ground rules and get on with this. Like with our weapons, we're defining support as anything whose primary intended purpose is to provide any form of healing, overshield, damage increase, damage resistance, ability regen, increased stats, damage vulnerability, or any other unlisted utility to someone other than ourselves. In this list, we will be including forms of crowd control, but only if it meets our criteria of supporting the team rather than being used offensively. I'm also going to try to do a better job of taking PvP into account with this list. And finally, I'll be adding a category called Honorable Mentions. This category will be made for anything that doesn't fall explicitly under our definition of support, but maybe through simple changes to a build can be used to support. Okay, I think that covers our ground rules. Let's just go ahead and jump right into this. So Titans, we are going to start with you. Firstly, we have the Aeon Cult. Now, this exotic functions the same on all 3 classes, so I'll just go ahead and talk about it just this one time. I think I'm going to put it in the B tier. But this one is so dependent on team composition and your chosen sect that you could probably argue everything from A to C tier depending on a lot of things. Either way though, I'll kind of split it in the middle because it offers solid and diverse utility, so I think it deserves the B tier spot. Next we have Arbor Warden. I think I'm going to put it in the C tier. In PvE, it's not super useful, but you can get some pretty clutch saves on injured teammates. While I personally haven't used it in PvP, I have heard from people that it's pretty solid, so I think that C tier is a safe bet. Next we have the Citan's Ramparts. Once the bane of every PvP player, Citan's has been nerfed enough that I did put it into D tier. I almost never see it used in PvE because you honestly just don't really need to. And in PvP, well, to be honest with you, you'd probably be safer holding up some tinfoil. It's certainly not unusable, but I can't rightly say that it's better than the exotics above it. Next we have Crest of Alpha Lupi. Lupi? Lupi? Either one. So I actually had a really hard time deciding this one. I decided to put it into C tier. I wouldn't say that it's a bad exotic. Personally, I really like it. I love it, and I use it very frequently. It functions well on pretty much every subclass, and it's pretty decent in PvP. I think the problem is that it's just a product from its time, and it's a tad bit too basic in today's sandbox. Orb generation is easier than it's ever been, and there are much better ways of healing your teammates than a barricade. Again, not a bad exotic. You can definitely get plenty of use out of it, but there are just better options. Next we have Helm of Saint 14. Whew. It's a shame that one of the best looking helmets in the game is going to be put so low, but I had to put Helm in the C tier. The blinding effect is just kind of meh. It does get a bit more value from providing weapons of light, which saved it from being put in the D tier, but even then, Ward of Dawn just isn't the super that it used to be when buff stacking was a thing. Next we have Hoarfrost Z. I'm going to go ahead and put it in B tier. It's honestly got a lot going for it. Great protection, tons of stat boost, synergizes very well with a lot of stasis builds. I don't see it used a whole lot these days, but I definitely think it's a great support exotic for all my stasis enjoyers out there. Next we have the Phoenix Cradle. And I'm going to go ahead and throw this bad boy in S tier. The restoration and improved ability regen is fantastic. Plus, sunspots in general are already good, and it's pretty easy to create sunspots, especially in PvE. Once you get a chain going, you can get a very high uptime on restoration and ability gen for both you and your teammates. Next we have Precious Scars. Another easy S tier. I mean, it's a no cooldown burst of restoration on any subclass. You can take this thing into literally any piece of content and get a ton of value out of it. The only downside to running this thing is that it looks terrible. It really does. It's so ugly. But if you don't care too much about fashion, though, Precious Scars is easily one of the best support exotics in the game. Next, we have Ursa Furiosa, and I think I'm going to put it in B tier. Gaining super energy, especially through blocking damage for your team, is always nice. Plus, you give your team that sweet damage increase. I understand why some people may feel it deserves a lower spot, but I really think this exotic is kind of slept on, as well as the super, and I highly recommend it for anyone who enjoys kind of playing the tank fantasy. Okay, and lastly, our honorable mentions for Titan. We have the Armamentarium, Hallowfire Heart, and Heart of Inmost Light. Hunters, you guys are up next. First off, we have the Blight Ranger. A decent way of blocking damage to fulfill a tank fantasy on Hunter, but the main thing that makes it a support exotic is the Blinding Burst. These two things, though, aren't hard to come by, so unfortunately, I'm sorry I had to give it the D tier. Next, we have Gemini Jester, and I gave it a C tier. Disorienting on dodge can actually be a pretty good way to get a teammate out of a tough spot in PvE. I also do understand that some of my PvPers do enjoy it for the radar removal, so I think C tier is fair. Next, Gyrfalcons, I believe that's pronounced, yeah. So this thing is absolutely stacked with effects. In terms of what it does for supporting our team, I gave it a respectable A tier. I love the idea of the reserve overshield, and I have absolutely seen it come in clutch in some tight situations. Plus, the class ability Recharge can help your fellow Titans and Warlocks keep themselves alive. Next, we have Mothkeeper's Wraps. I think I might get some pushback for this one, but I've got to go with D tier. I just don't see the appeal of it. Maybe one of you Mothkeeper enthusiasts can explain to me what you love about this thing, but I don't think I've ever seen anyone use it, actually. There are just better sources of blind and overshield, even some that don't take up an exotic slot. Next, we have the Omnioculus. I'm going to go with C tier. Don't get me wrong. I understand that going invisible doesn't mean you can't be hurt, especially in PvP. However, I still feel like the damage resistance is a bit redundant considering how often you do avoid taking damage with invisibility. Next up, Orpheus Rig. I'll give it a respectable B tier. Tether is a great support super that brings a lot of value to the Hunter support tools, and it's extremely easy to get a ton of super energy back from this. Personally, I'd like to put it higher, but I do want to try to be unbiased. I love this thing. It's great. Next, we have Renewal Grasps. So this one was a little tough, but I did settle on B tier. The damage reduction that it applies to enemies is great, plus it's a really good way of giving frost armor to your non-stasis teammates. If you wanted to say C tier, I would accept it, but I do personally think it deserves the B tier spot. Next, we have Speedloader Slacks. I'm going to go ahead and say A tier is appropriate here. The increased handling and reload speed can make a pretty substantial difference in boss damage phases, and the ability to refresh the buff makes it good for the neutral game too. It's definitely not a top tier support exotic, but it's probably my favorite Hunter exotic. And lastly, our honorable mentions for Hunter. We have Athre's Embrace, Frosties, Graviton Forfeit, Ophidia Spaith, Radiant Dance Machines, Bombardiers, and the Sixth Coyote. Last but not least, on to my fellow Warlocks. And we're going to start with Apotheosis Veil. Yeah, this is D tier. I'm sorry for any of my Apotheosis enjoyers out there, Bungie has tried a few times to make this thing a decent exotic, but at this point, I really think they'd have to do a rework on it, basically from the ground up, if they wanted to do that. It's definitely not unusable, but I mean, I don't think that it's going to be a hot take to say that it's D tier. Next up, we have the Ballador's Wrathweavers. I went with C tier. They're not bad, but the buffs that you give teammates are only applied when you're using your super. And if you're already using your super, then I imagine most things around you probably aren't going to live long enough for your teammates to really make use of those buffs anyways. The buffs are good, so maybe you could argue a B tier, like if it's in like really, really high-end content, or if you pair it with Frost Pulse or something like that, but for the vast majority of content in the game, I'm going to stand by a C tier. Next, we have Boots of the Assembler. I think Assembler deserves an A tier spot. Even when you don't pair these with Lumina, they still do a fantastic job of supporting your team. I think the only thing holding these from the S tier spot is the fact that you do have to stand in your rift for them to work, meaning any activities that require you to move around a lot may make it a bit more difficult to use these. Next, we have Briarbinds. I gave it a B tier. While there are plenty of other ways to apply Weaken, this is a really solid way of doing it. As long as you're remembering to pick up your Void Buddy, this is a great way to keep up a crazy high uptime on Weaken. Next, we have Cenotaph Mask. Oh yeah, the absolute pinnacle of fashion. I gave it a B tier. While it's definitely most effective when used with Divinity, you can still get tons of value out of it while using any Trace Rifle, and I do think Trace Rifles are in a pretty good spot right now. The ammo generation is a solid utility, and it was a pretty, decent staple of high-end content for a good while, and it's still good to this day. Next up, Fallen Sunstar. So fun fact, I actually didn't know Fallen Sunstar could be classified as a support exotic until I was making this video. I did give it a C tier. While it may not make a huge difference for our team, just with a little bit of ability regeneration, it is extremely easy to use. You just slap it on, and it'll give value to your teammates just by playing normally. Next, we have Fellwinters, and I think I'm going to throw it in the B tier. The weaken effect from it can actually have a pretty large area, and being able to accomplish this with finishers makes it pretty decent. Plus, it is subclass neutral, so this gives every subclass pretty reliable access to weaken. Next, we have Lunafactions. A now underrated classic, Lunafactions, I think, deserve an A tier spot. They used to be a staple for boss DPS phases even after their nerf in Year 3. Despite not being as commonly seen these days, they are still just as useful and the foundation for a few of my builds. Next, we have Phoenix Protocol. Another super energy exotic, not a whole lot to say with this one. Like the others, it deserves a B tier spot. Next, we have Prometheum Spur. This is 100% just a skill issue on my part, but I gave it a D tier. I'm sure it's one of those that you just have to put in some time to get really good with, but why would I do that when I could just equip an exotic that's better and easier to use? If any of my Prometheum Spur enjoyers out there want to tell me that I'm wrong and bad, I will understand. I know it's a skill issue, but I just can't enjoy this thing. Next, we have Speaker's Sight. By far, easiest S tier on this list. This helmet is arguably the single best support exotic in the entire game right now. And I'll admit, I was actually skeptical of this thing when it first came out. I really thought that it was just going to be mid. But it has quickly become the foundation of my most used build by far, and I have fallen in love with this thing. Next, we have the Stag. This is another one that I had a hard time deciding. It's not one that I personally particularly enjoy, but I have seen it used quite a bit to good success, and I know that it's become a pretty decent exotic in today's sandbox. So, I think it deserves the B tier spot. Next, we have Verity's Brow. I can safely say this rests in the A tier. The grenade energy that you can give to your teammates through this is insane. Seriously, go look up like Vault of Glass Verity's build strategy. It's amazing. Also, while you would be losing out on the damage, another thing that kind of gives this a bump in my opinion is that the grenade recharge rate does affect healing grenades if that's something that you want to do. And our Warlock honorable mentions, we have Chromatic Fire, Claws of Ahamkara, Sanguine Alchemy, Secant Filament, Secant. It's the filaments, and Starfire Protocol. Wow. Okay. I think that was everything. Armor was certainly more of a challenge than weapons, and I'm not nearly as versed with every armor piece as I am with weapons, so I apologize if I overlooked something in this ranking. I would have liked to have gone more in depth with all of these, but I didn't realize there would be so many exotics that can be classified as support armor, so I didn't want to make this video, 30, 40, however many minutes long. I don't even know what I'm at right now, but I didn't want to make it crazy long. Otherwise, though, tell me what you think, and let me know if there are any exotic armor pieces that you think that I missed. I also want to apologize again for how long this took to get out, and for all of the delays that I had to keep posting about, but I hope to have the final tier list over weapon perks and origin traits out around this time next week. I do sincerely appreciate y'all's patience while I got this out, and I really hope you enjoyed it. I think all I've got left to say is that I've been Doc. Take care of yourselves, be good to others, don't fill up on appetizers next time you go out to eat, and I will catch y'all in the next one.